Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today we have with us Lawrence Liang from Alternate Law Forum. Lawrence, it has been a tragic week in which we have had Aaron Swartz committing suicide, being hounded literally as his family has held to his death by the kind of indictment that was being done by the US government. You have known Aaron since his Creative Commons days. So what was the immediate background in which this tragic event happened?
Prabir, you're right. I think it's important to note that all of us are collectively mourning the death of an extremely talented and an extremely generous individual. And the context, of course, that is immediately can be attributed to one of the reasons for his committing suicide was the fact that he was facing a very, very difficult trial ahead. Because a couple of years ago, he had basically plugged his computer onto the MIT network and had downloaded approximately 4 million articles from JSTOR, the database that is one of the primary databases for social science and other science journals. And he had intended to make it freely available. Now, I suppose this act of his in many ways marks Aaron's kind of, short life, but one which was marked by a certain commitment and activism around the idea of free knowledge. His anger at databases like JSTOR was the fact that they charge exorbitant amounts of money to provide access, which meant that they're not available to most people in the world, without paying any royalty to the authors who have contributed to the articles or to the people who do the peer review of the articles. So here is a scenario which is rent control of the worst kind, essentially of knowledge which is completely, privatized and enclosed. There are a number of reasons.
Public knowledge which is enclosed
Absolutely.
in this particular way.
Most researchers, most academics who work and contribute towards the making of journals do not get compensated for it, but are paid for by public money because they happen to be, employed by universities or research centers.
And then all this material goes behind paywalls.
Absolutely.
Whether it's IEEE, it's ACM, for instance, in my kind of areas, law journals, everything essentially then becomes paid for when you want to access it. And it's very difficult for a lot of students in the third world, universities, college teachers to access those kind of journals.
And that's the context that I think we have to understand Aaron's career and his life, because a lot of what he was involved with was really about ways of democratizing access to information and access to technology. He was one of the key people behind the campaign to stop, the SOPA, which is the Stop Online Piracy Act. He was also, of course, at the age of 14, active supporter of the Creative Commons, etc. So in a way, here is a person who is in some ways very atypical because of his brilliance, but also very typical of a certain generation. And this is a generation that is the post-internet generation. You have an entire generation of young people who are born digital and who in a way have been acutely aware of the possibilities made by free availability of information. So Aaron's radicalization and his kind of radical politics was steeped within, the kind of information ecology that we all inhabit. So in a way, what we're looking at here is on the one hand the death of one person, but I would also like to place this in a larger context, which is really the relationship between curiosity and transgression and punishment. Because if one were to draw the long arc from Aaron's death right through the history of intellectual property, right through injunctions that have always existed around who can and who cannot access knowledge, the price that people have paid is always a very high one. From the mythological time, if you were to consider the idea of the stealth of fire by Prometheus, and the punishment for that was really, the perpetual punishment by the eagle, biting at his liver. Or if you were to move further down, the entire idea of who is entitled in India to listen to the Vedas or who is entitled to knowledge of a certain kind, marked by severe punishment, right? So if the Manusmriti has punishment like pouring of molten lead into the ears of a lower caste person.
Story in the Ramayana.
Yeah. So I think that this entire, so if we were to trace this long arc, Aaron is the last victim in a system in which the privatization of knowledge and its transgression as acts of resistance, as acts of self-exploration, have always been met by harsh punishment. And in the case of Aaron, what had happened was that the charges that had been filed against him by JSTOR had been dropped by JSTOR. But the US government, the federal government, decided to proceed with it. And he would have had to pay $1 million in fine and spend up to 35 years in jail had he been convicted. And I think that this is a moment which is both sad, but also at the same time, I think Aaron has really become a symbol. A number of people on the internet are now talking about a number of actions to commemorate Aaron's life. So academics have now started putting up copyrighted articles of theirs which were locked up in databases and making them available online as a gesture of defiance.
The hashtag PDF tribute
yes,
to be put on Twitter and so on, giving the URLs.
And you also have someone else who has called for a law to be named after Aaron, because you have something known as the Sonny Bono legislation in the US, which was basically a law that extended the term of copyright. I think it's only appropriate, given what has happened, to think of the equivalent of an access to knowledge law, which is named after Aaron as a tribute to him.
Lawrence, walk us through a little bit of what is the kind of contribution Aaron has made, because a lot of the internet whiz kids today have made billions, like for instance the Facebook owner and so on. Aaron had that possibility as well, which he didn't take. But what are his major contributions that we can talk about?
I mean, he's one of the typical kind of whiz kid, computing whiz kids who at the age of 7 had already started programming and was very prolific with computers. And at the age of 14, he basically contributed towards the development of the standards for what is known as the RSS feed. And this was the standard of the first RSS 1.0 feed. Now, that's a remarkable achievement. We are talking about, especially from the perspective of a country where we are not allowed to become adults till we are like 25 years old. A 14-year-old contributing this has all the makings of a Bill Gates to be. But Aaron's contributions...
I think I would take umbrage at that, because I think Bill Gates really did not contribute technologically anything of a similar kind. I think his main contribution was that he could copy things quickly.
Yeah, but when I say Bill Gates, I mean literally this figure of the techno geek young genius of sorts, right?
Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and so on.
So what distinguishes Aaron from, let's say, your typical innovators, the young whiz kid innovators, is the fact that all of Aaron's contributions were really towards developing certain kinds of infrastructures of the internet. I think he was really, kind of in a way recognized very early on that infrastructures are not to be taken for granted. One has to work on them, one has to kind of develop them, and then one has to kind of, sustain them. And that's kind of what he was involved with the Wikimedia Foundation and with Wikipedia. He was involved with the Creative Commons, and then of course coordinating, the entire online as well as offline campaign against the SOPA. That's the kind of environment I would say that he that you have to see his life in, and it's a tragic loss. So
also the Open Library
as well. So if you look at the idea that Aaron had of what, if a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs creates value, which is primarily accrued through the idea of a single company and the rise of the shares and the prices of a single company, Aaron's contributions in terms of creating value is really in terms of building robust infrastructures that enable public access. So the act of downloading 4 million articles from JSTOR, I see that as a stupendous act of generosity. It's a cliche to use the Robin Hood myth, but there are some times when some people transcend the ordinary levels of kind of in a way subversive acts on the internet, which is relatively easy, to actually become something more. And I think that Aaron reached that by downloading these 4 million articles and wanting to make them available online.
JSTOR has also taken a decision to make a lot of its material public. So a consequence of really the case. This happened before Aaron died. So it had also had an impact even on JSTOR.
It has, yes and no. Because a lot of what JSTOR was actually making available are really old articles. Right? They're making articles in which there's no copyright that actually subsists. So if you look at what they have released as their kind of contribution to the public domain, it's a little wishy-washy, because it's the numbers that people refer to, but it's not the articles themselves, and the articles themselves are actually only the really old ones. So if you're looking at cutting-edge research, now this is really what was needed in terms of the latest kind of material. And I think again what is really crucial is that if you look at Aaron as contributing to the development of knowledge in a particular way, you have a scenario where one half of the world or more than that has no access to these databases, and in other words, therefore, are not in a way engaged in an intellectual conversation on what's happening. Aaron's Act actually frees up the database and opens up the database, which has incredible consequences for science. It has incredible consequences for knowledge itself. If you were to pit this against the question of legality, the legality question is a boring, dumb, and a stupid question to be asking.
But there is an interesting question even there, though you do dismiss it as boring and dumb, because if you look at what the people who are defending Aaron in courts were saying, that even if they had lost the case, what the punishment at most that could accrue was far below what they were offering to settle the case. Right. So the government seems to have really gone after it with a vengeance. Now, what do you think explains this? Because I really, for me, I really don't understand that why would such a vengeance be there for an act like this, unless we see it as something that the Obama administration as well as the current US administration really of different kinds have always are looking at the whistleblowers as the main threat and the hacker community as subversive because it can access things like WikiLeaks and so on. So do you think this is a part of that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think, this has to be seen in the context of what happened with the WikiLeaks. It also has to be seen in the context of the strategy that the US government has generally been deploying, which you could describe as a shock and awe strategy of, maximum punishment so that you set an example, you create a deterrent effect. This is not the first time that this is happening. This has already happened in the past where it wasn't so much about the imprisonment factor there as much as the fine factor. There are students who set up kind of, university networks which allow them to share and have file sharing networks within the university who have actually been where action has been taken against them, millions of dollars of fine sought to be recovered from them. And the most dramatic one was a case where the university student only had $800 in his bank and they were asking him for whatever, like $30 million, etc. And they took the $800. But what they did end up doing was that, this person was no radical. He said, I just did it because I was a techno geek. But going through the process of defending myself has now made me an information politics radical. So I think that just as every movement has a momentum created by the figure of a martyr, and it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we need martyrs. It seems as though Aaron might well be the first martyr of the free information movement of this kind.
So you think that essentially this is the part of the war against information freedom that the US government has really launched or has been doing for quite some time.
Yeah. And WikiLeaks is of course a crucial moment because of the kind of embarrassment that they had to go through, as well as of the fact that it revealed in a way the kind of fragility of their own networks. And I think that the classical response of the law has always been the iron hand response.
Lawrence, this is the last point that I would like to look at, that the more information is digitized, the more easy it is to really break it out of its prison. So therefore the need to increase the legal hammer, if you will, to protect that. Is that what we are seeing? The inability to really protect information, and therefore it's legal strengthening, trying to strengthen the legal boundaries?
I think that I would try to draw a connection here between two things. One is that as information gets digitized and as information in a way becomes digitized, it's also encountering this paradox of the claim of property upon it, right? But if property claims has historically been grounded on the idea of the tangible, it's not an easy claim to translate. So it's a fiction. The idea of information as property is fiction. Now, the question I would link this to is that how do you protect fictions? You take the other example that you have, which is borders between countries. Borders between countries are accidents, they're fiction, they create artificial barriers between people, but they're also extremely strong fictions in their ability to wreak havoc and violence on the lives of people. And just as you need the army to protect the fiction of the border, you need a strong police to protect the fiction of information as property. And I think that seems to be what is happening here. Because you have a scenario where the internet in a way transcends borders. It transcends the possibility of protecting barbed wires, etc., as you would your garden. And so you have also the equal rise of a global police that has to protect this fiction. So I think it has to be understood in that kind of continuum. And that really is the battle lines of information politics today.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's been
Thank you.
Extremely interesting talking to you, and we'll continue to discuss the information, freedom and war in the future.
Thank you.